Good afternoon all. Thank you for coming to my talk. I was always nervous when I come to these things that I'm only going to get a couple of people. For those of you who think you might have come to the wrong talk, please stay, because it's going to be very interesting. We're going to look at the NEC4 style of contract. My name is Ben Walker. I'm the CEO of CMAR, but I thought that perhaps I'd use this speaking slot to talk about what CMAR's built for rather than the software itself, and turn it over and have a good look through the NEC formal contract. So specifically, with the launch of NEC4 back in June this year, I thought it'd be useful to do a little presentation on the main key changes affecting practitioners in our space and how they might need to shift from NEC3 to NEC4. And obviously NEC4 is quite a big collection of different contracts. So I've chosen the ECC, given it's perhaps going to serve most of us sat here. But a lot of the changes are generic as well, so what we cover today in the ECC will in the large part be true also for the service contracts and the various other forms. As I say, we don't cover all the changes, but we're going to focus on the actual procedures and some of the day-to-day management considerations. So NEC4 was never supposed to be a revolution. It was more of an evolution of what we had before. And the authoring team tried very hard to embody as many of those Z clauses and look at it how NEC was actually being used in practice. So a lot of the changes here you may already do through Z clauses, and hopefully you'll see it as being more of a streamlining to what's actually happening out there in the real world. We also try to minimise the differences between the various forms in the family. So there are a few forms that, because they were added later, have taken things a little bit slicker, a little bit newer, and we wanted the rest of the family of contracts to catch up. So we're minimising the differences between them as well. Some general terminology changes here across most of the family now. The employer becomes client, which I think might be a little bit more intuitive. We now have, finally, gender-neutral drafting. And there's various other streamlining changes to some of the secondary options and some of the vocabulary. Let's have a look at some specifics then. So clause 10, I also work as an examiner for ICE's Law and Contract Management examinations, and it's amazing how many candidates reply to nearly every question by saying, well, in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, perhaps we'd agree to do this. And that's fine, and certainly we should act in that way. But clause 10 also, very importantly, says that we should act as stated in the contract, and we felt that perhaps wasn't coming through quite as strongly as it should be. So that clause has been split now into two parts, just to remind us that we must act as stated in the contract, and of course in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. A couple more defined terms, and again some boilerplate stuff that's been added to really catch up with what we're all doing via Z clauses. This is a key change. The risk register has always caused a bit of confusion, and one of my colleagues wrote a blog called The Risk of Confusing Your Risk Registers. So to kind of give a degree of separation from a project risk register, we have renamed NEC's risk register to the early warning register, which I think is exactly what it is. And this perhaps better reflects what we're doing here. We're managing early warnings at contract level. Project risk register comes with all sorts of other connotations, like perhaps pricing and allocation of risk, which of course the risk register in NEC3 does not do. We don't use the risk register as a contract document, it's a management tool. I think renaming it to the early warning gives it that separation from perhaps the broader project activities. And later on we'll also see that at clause 80 we've changed employers' risks to client liabilities, which again gives us that separation and is a bit more what it actually is. Works information, and indeed in the service contract, service information, these are all now collectively referred to as scope, so this is a general use of the term scope across the forms. We have a clearer definition of subcontractor. In NEC3, lots of people were mixing up subcontractor and supplier, perhaps missing that really important treatment of are the plant and materials specifically wholly or partly designed for the works. That test was quite often ignored, so you might have cladders or glazers mistreated as suppliers when in fact they might be subcontractors. it's a bit clearer now under NEC4. It's also explicit around labour-only or equipment-only hire as not being subcontract. So there's a bit more clarity around that. Clause 13.2, again, is moving us further into the real world of communication systems now. But if you don't choose one, then obviously the advice still remains: get some standard stationery, even if that is a set of Word documents as a last resort. But get that standard stationery. So many people I talk to don't have that standard stationery, and one of the really good benefits of having an agreed set of notifications, instruction, templates, is that early on in an NEC contract, having a system or a set of communication templates that have been agreed by the parties can take out any emotive reaction of, blimey, these guys must be lawyered up, seriously lawyered up, because they're instructing me under this clause. It allows us to be frank, precise, contractually accurate, without necessarily appearing adversarial, which I think is a bit of a hangover from traditional contracting, but still creeps up now and then. Let's move on to early warnings. I'm going to try and leave as much time as possible for questions at the end, and we'll open that up to any kind of question. But if you're desperate to ask a question, then please put your hand up, because it's much better if there's a bit of interaction. So clause 15. This is now where early warnings sit. So the big change we've already mentioned is now called the early warning register rather than the risk register. But there's a little bit more in the mix now. Nothing groundbreaking. The project manager now prepares a first early warning register within 1 week of the starting date. But now there's an early warning sort of meeting interval. So we hold early warning meetings regularly, which I think was a lot of the time the practice that was followed anyway. So you can still hold an early warning meeting whenever you want. Of course, if you have an urgent, pressing early warning to discuss, then you might hold it this afternoon. But you'd hold it no less frequently than the interval in contract data. And also now there's express mention of subcontractors potentially needing to attend. So that's brought to the fore a little bit more as well. Okay, I'll perhaps have a show of hands. How many people, firstly I suppose I should ask, how many people use NEC contracts? Brilliant, okay, nearly everyone. How many people are aware of the kind of value engineering element within an option C or D contract that's already there? So this is where the contractor comes up with a good idea and they can share some of the savings? Yeah, okay, a few people, but not everybody. So let me firstly outline that. In an NEC target contract, where we set a target and then we track the costs against it, and at the end of completion we share the difference, pain or gain as it's colloquially known. There is a mechanism, and it's at clause 6311, and what it says is if the project manager comes up with a good idea and instructs a change to the service the works information, now called scope, then of course that's just a compensation event. And that's one of the compensation events that can bring about a reduction in price as much as an increase. So if the project manager comes up with a good idea, they would give an instruction changing the works information, now we call it the scope. That would give rise to a compensation event, and the assessment of that compensation event could be a reduction to the prices by the full saving in defined cost. But what if a contractor comes up with that idea? Well, if a contractor comes up with that idea and proposes it to the project manager, and then it's subsequently adopted, under options C and D, the prices do not reduce. So you still have the compensation assessment, but the prices don't change the total of the prices. The target stays where it is. Now, naturally, the costs come in less because it was a good idea, and therefore the share ranges and share percentages that make up that target mechanism take effect, and you have that margin, that gain share, all things being equal. So that's an existing mechanism, and if you're not using it, contractors, if there's contractors in the room, then you can go and make some money tomorrow, because you can generate that saving under the target by coming up with good ideas. Appreciate it's not that overtly in the contract. Perhaps we should put a margin note next to it and actually call it value engineering. What the brief to the NEC4 drafters was, okay, it is there, perhaps it's not well known, we should do a straw poll, make more of it, but there isn't actually an equivalent in option A or B. So in the priced contracts where we're operating an activity schedule, for instance, there is no motivation, there's no incentive to a contractor to come up with a good idea and present it, because same thing happens. Project manager says, oh, that's a brilliant idea, thank you very much. As a compensation event. But under A and B, that would just reduce the total of the prices, that would reduce the contractor's turnover ultimately, and any profit they were going to make within that turnover. So we felt we needed something else, and this is now at clause 16, and this is fairly common now across the NEC suite. So the contractor can come up with a good idea and formally propose it expressly under clause 16.1. There's a 4-week response criteria defined in 16.2. If the project manager doesn't have to accept it if they don't want to, but this is a proposal to reduce the cost of providing the works, if you like. Under A and B then, the compensation event's triggered because it's still a change to the scope. The compensation event that arises is assessed in the usual way, but the change to the prices is not the full value of the compensation event. It's tempered by the value engineering percentage, which by default is 50%, but that can be changed in contract data part 1. When you're setting up your contract, you could choose a different percentage. So the value engineering percentage is the element that the client keeps as their benefit. I can't see a good reason to change it from 50%, but there we go. And as we said, in options C and D, this benefit is already this dynamic. It's a bit different because it works on actuals, but the dynamic is the proxy to it is already there. So hopefully this is going to be an overt value engineering clause that's going to make a fairly big difference in incentivising contractors under priced contracts. What have we done in terms of time? Well, the format of the programme is now stated in the scope, so we bring that out a little bit more. We try and encourage that, and certainly through the how-to guides, some top tips on, so the how-to guide's now incorporated within volume 2 of the guidance note. So that's an absolute must. If you're preparing service information, works information, now it's called scope. If you're preparing scope, then please do get a copy of volume 2. There's worked examples of how to set up your scope. Within the scope, there's a chapter on how to write, how to kind of suggestions on how to specify how you would like your program submitted, and there's some useful top tips in that. In NEC3, I haven't worked this out yet for NEC4, but in NEC3 there were 28 places in the contract which said in accordance with the works information. So the works information was much more than just specification and constraints. It really told you how to run the contract. And the how to write works information, now called Guidance Note 2, preparing an ECC contract is a must and something you should have on the shelf. So that will help you do that. Simple things like when you submit your program, there must be an element in it that easily identifies deliverables by the employer or others so that I can see how they've changed since last time. That will make program acceptance far easier to digest. Little things like that make a big difference, improve the rate of accepted programs. There's now a deemed acceptance, or treated acceptance is the actual term, protocol built into the programming clauses. So if the project manager does not respond to a submitted program within 2 weeks, the contractor may prompt regarding that failure to respond. And if no response is forthcoming for a further week, then the program is treated as accepted. Now again, we know, don't we, at clause 14, it's going to be a little bit geeky now, but in clause 14.1, acceptance of something doesn't change the contractor's obligation to provide the works or liability for their design. But it does change your obligations. So treated acceptance could sign the client up to delivering things within a certain time in accordance with that program. So treated acceptance is important. Hello.
If the contractor doesn't prompt them after 2 weeks, is it still counted as accepted after 3?
No. So a bit like the sanctions with regard to quotation, treated acceptance. The time period, which for quotations is 2 weeks, for program it's 1. We try to make it as short as possible because we don't want it to get too uncontemporary. Then those sanctions are only triggered after that reminder, which may be given. So it's subject to that trigger. So in program, hugely important. We could talk for hours, in fact, days about the program, but we better move on. In fact, at this point, I'd just say Glenn Hyde is also speaking. I'm not sure where. I think it's 3:15. He's going to talk a lot more about the program. So maybe get yourselves along to that talk as well. It should be very interesting. Just to double check, there was nothing else to say about programme at this stage. I think that's pretty much what we need to cover. Okay, quality management. It used to be called test defects as a chapter. We're now renamed it quality management. Lots of people were putting a Z clause in to insert quality management systems and policies and objectives. That's now taken the place of clause 40. Test inspections, pretty much as they were. The verb has changed though. We're no longer notifying them, they're now informed. Now, I know this is a riveting, exciting difference for nearly all of us in the room. It really got me very interested. I'll very briefly explain that the geeky part here is that some of you will know and hopefully follow. Clause 13.7 tells us that notifications to be separately communicated. Now, this didn't work very practically with test inspections where we might be wanting to notify a block of them at once. So the verb is now inform rather than notify. Small change, but some of the geeks among us will like that. Moving on to payment. Application for payment is now a must. Quite often we'd see Z clauses around 50.4 saying, which currently in NEC4 says the project manager considers an application for payment made by the contractor. We've now turned that around so an application for payment must be submitted. If there's no application, the amount due is the lesser of the amount due at the previous assessment date and the amount due the project manager assesses. For instance, it could be, if no works had happened, then there might still be a negative net change, the amount due, maybe owing to delay damages or low service damages or whatever it might be. So I think, again, aligning it, I don't know how vast this problem was. I don't know that many contractors who weren't submitting applications for payment and relying on their project managers to do that legwork, but this just makes it a bit more formal, or very much more formal, and now applications are required. How are we doing for time? Compensation events. We've always had this interaction between what we used to call employers' risks and compensation rate number 14 in the list under clause 60. That's still there, it's just we don't call them employers' risks anymore, we call them client liabilities. And additional compensation events now are quotations for proposed instructions that are not accepted. So I don't know if any of you contractors felt this pain to some extent, where the employer under NEC4 quite often perhaps wanted to explore different options and perhaps not all of them would come to fruition. And depending on what main option you were under, it could get quite expensive for the contractor to run around doing these things. So if you're going to instruct a quotation now for a proposed instruction or a proposed change decision, in an EC4, a proposed instruction, then you're going to have to pay for that in the event you don't use it. And also additional compensation events stated in contract data. So rather than listing out new compensation events as Z clauses, we can just populate them nice and neatly into contract data part 1. Please remember, keep them as objective triggers. Don't go start talking about provisional sums and how much it might be and whose fault it'll be. Nice, clear statements. You've got to re-envisage them as appearing in that list under clause 60.1. Little tidy up, just perhaps a little bit easier to use this under clause 63.1. So we now have a dividing date. So for events arising from the project manager and the supervisor, it's the original date of that original communication. So it could be an instruction, a certificate perhaps. For other compensation events, the dividing date is the date of the notification of that event. So if it's a weather event, it would be the date of the notification of the event. And this dividing date, I think, just makes it a bit easier to talk about this. 63.1 is the main clause for giving us the rules around assessing how we assess the change to prices. It talks about using defined cost. It talks about actual defined cost and forecast defined cost and the resulting fee. And so we needed a date that separates those two things. Now, this is an NEC4 concept, but without giving it a full definition, we've kind of coined the phrase dividing date. And that's used in later language throughout other bits of the contract as an easy way of saying this is the threshold in time within which, as you can see here, the revised clause 63.5 talks about using the accepted program current at the dividing date, which gets us a little bit closer to that big question around how do we assess time impacts. So there's a bit more guidance there, and NEC have also released a guidance practice note on this as well. Proposed instructions, they're always a little bit homeless in clause 61.2, so we've lifted them out and given them their own sort of sub-clause, and now they're at 65, so there's a whole piece on proposed instructions now at clause 65, which means implementation's now at 66. So clearly differentiating themselves from compensation events. Costs of preparing the quotation are no longer excluded in options A and B, and in fact, any compensation event quotation in A and B now is no longer excluded, so you can recover the defined costs of putting those together. Options A and B themselves, so defined cost is the cost of components in the short schedule of cost components. I haven't yet asked why we dropped the ER off that, as it was a shorter schedule of cost components. It's the short schedule of cost components. And we have, I think, a far more practical, far more what we were doing as an industry. We've now got people rates. So rather than having a big long debate about somebody's salary calculated rate, we tender people rates. New rates may be agreed post-contract date. So I think that's become much sort of easier to follow. And options A and B always use the short schedule and only the short schedule, and that's all the short schedule is used for. So if you're in C, D and E, in NEC4, you used to be able to use the short schedule under certain conditions. That's not there anymore. So it's a bit simpler in its application. Subcontractors are included as part of the schedule. So even in the full schedule of cost components for C, D and E, there's the definition of defined cost has got simpler because they now live in the schedule. No people overheads, no working area overheads in the full schedule. No overhead on rates for manufacture and design. Components 5 and 6. It's a far easier thing to manage, procure, and financially evaluate as well in a tender situation. And there's a single fee percentage too. Option C, D, E and F, the contractor notifies the project manager when part of defined cost has been finalised. This is quite a big change. So when it comes to correcting a mistake in a later assessment, we can still do that, save for what's been agreed and locked in terms of defined cost. So we found that what was happening on some projects was the employer in NEC3 might wheel in a super duper cost expert in the later stages of the project and maybe revisit defined cost from day one. And that wasn't really in keeping with the spirit of no shocks and no surprises and dealing with things as we go along. So now the contractor can kind of mitigate that to a certain extent by by locking in defined cost within 13 weeks of submitting it. And you can still correct payment assessments, but you can't go back and unlock that box. I think, save for fraud, you can't go back and unlock those costs. So there's a bit more certainty around that. And again, we have another treated acceptance in the event there's just things are just ignored. The schedule of cost components in C, D and E, again, subcontractors now included, no working area overheads and no overheads on rates for manufacture and design. Downside with the working area overhead bit, for those of you who are super geeky cost engineers, there was a charge at 4, which was basically a percentage recovery over the people costs. That just got a bit unwieldy. There's a few reasons why it perhaps wasn't the best approach. So that's gone. It's simpler, but it does mean, of course, you need to keep that little shoebox full of receipts for the stuff you might consume in your site hat. And again, single fee percentage. Not masses to say. Some of these are just a renaming, but I suppose if you're not subject to the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act, then W3 is a new thing that's available to you. So instead of adjudication and then tribunal, we can go dispute avoidance board and then tribunal as an option if you're not subject to the Act. There's had to be a slight tweak to the adjudicator contract. It's now called dispute services contract. I quite like the tweak because we've now got adjudicator or dispute avoidance board. We've had to coin a phrase that sits across both of them, and it's the dispute resolver, which I always think sounds like something out of a Western, which is pretty cool. I might like to try and do that one day. So, yep, there's slight changes there. Information modelling. So that's at X10 now. Partnering, to all intents and purposes, the same clauses. We've just renamed it multi-party collaboration. X15, if you're a contractor, the burden of proof is now reversed. So it's still obviously reasonable skill and care, but it's to be proved that you didn't employ reasonable skill and care rather than proving that you did. We have this new thing called whole life cost, and I'm really keen to see how this pans out. Again, it's a value engineering type thing, but rather than proposals to reduce cost, which you do through clause 16 that we looked at earlier, whole life cost, this is a secondary option if you choose it. This enables you to, as a contractor, come up with an idea you think might reduce the overall operating or maintenance cost of that asset throughout its whole life, the thing that we're building. Then you can provide a quotation, and you do so in consultation with the project manager, and it allows you to come up with innovations. So it's an interesting clause. That'd be interesting to see how it's used and if it's tweaked. So in summary, it's an evolution, not a revolution. There's still anybody who's sort of spent money doing the project manager accreditation course, which is extremely popular and very well worth doing. That's not money wasted. There's a top-up course now available to just do basically to go through this, and you'll be recertified as NEC4 as well as NEC3 project manager or supervisor course. Better reflection of how effective teams applied ECC3. So I've been looking at good practice and trying to grow the procedures or refine the procedures to embody that. It's more practical, so we've not got people running around trying to work out salary calculated rates of people under priced contracts when you simply don't have cost engineers available to you. Greater clarity on use of the programme, compensation events, dividing dates. We've probably got some further understanding to achieve, I think it's fair to say, in terms of a common approach to assessing delay. But there's lots of good schools of thoughts out there on how to do that, and we're getting closer. Facilitates more proactive management of projects. So with contractors' proposals, whole life costing, a slightly more defined way of using the programme. I think hopefully it's not groundbreaking change, but it's definitely a move in the right direction, and it's a culmination predominantly of feedback through the user group. So please do keep in touch with that. Couple of, so before we start questions, I just thought of a few as I stood here, so I thought I'd stick them in. The big one, if you're if you're a contractor or a client, just be aware that clause 73.2, this is title to excavated materials and materials from demolition. The traditional way of the contractor taking title to those in NEC3 was the opposite, and now in NEC4 it's back to you. So if you do by right have title to excavated materials, so I just urge you to read that bit carefully before you embark on a contract, assuming one way or the other. As I always say, I've been saying this for a long time, I think to make NEC a success, you need to think in terms of three things. We really need to embrace this culture of collaboration. NEC contracts are very formal, that you have to communicate in a form that can be read, copied and recorded, which means in writing. But it doesn't say anywhere that you have to only communicate in that way. Of course, we're still trying to very much foster dialogue, and collaboration, talking, discussion. So the culture is really key. Knowledge, obviously a knowledge of these contracts. I still, regardless of CMAR and other systems, I still open the contract, whether I'm programming with a programming software package or I'm whatever I'm doing, I still open the contract and actually find out where I am, and then when I'm writing my communications or having meetings, I would mirror the language in there so that the other party, when they receive my communications, they can see what it is I'm trying to do, and we're not having to invent extra words like practical completion, which don't exist, or snagging is another one. We know what it means, but it doesn't exist. So knowledge is important, and then compliance. We can let things snowball out of control and run away with us if we don't do this month's work this month. So NEC has always been quite a timely, demanding contract in terms of that sense, and we have to try and keep up with it. So culture, knowledge and compliance is, I think, three key areas to think about covering them off. I've got time to say this, so I perhaps will about the program as well. Try and get the program working for you. Don't see it as a burden once a month to have to go and update the program. Turn that around. So try and drive it from the bottom up. Try and get some daily input into the program so that it becomes the living tool that it's useful for. And there's some good webinars on NEC Contract website that give you some top tips around doing that. Don't forget as well, not accepting a program for a reason in the contract is not the easy way out for the project manager. So I worry some project managers might have a 1,500 line program and they're looking through it and they think, I'm not going to accept that. I don't know possibly what I'll be doing if I accept that, so I'm going to sit on it. Two problems there. Firstly, we throw the whole thing into chaos and all sorts of other bits and pieces are triggered. But secondly, there's actually an obligation upon you if you do that. Clause 64.1 tells you you have to assess all the compensation events. Not many people see that link, so there's a little link there. If you don't have a program, if you withhold acceptance to a program submission for a reason in the contract, like it's not practical, not realistic, that's not the end of the story for the project manager. You then have to go and assess the compensation events that are live at that time. So let's tackle with the issue, really tackle it head on. I think we should open up to questions, so we've got a few minutes. Anything NEC at all? Yeah.
Question really is around. I think my question is really around the deemed acceptance of program. Could you just recap the timelines from the time the contractor submits the program to the project manager, and then just run through those timelines before the actual deemed acceptance in the NEC, in the revised NEC4 contract, please? Okay, so a program might be submitted at any time by the contractor. You typically have 2 weeks to reply to that program. So if you don't reply to it within those 2 weeks, then at any time after that, the contractor may remind you that you have failed to reply. So similar to the question from the lady over there, it could be the 15th day, or it could be the 43rd day after that. And we'd hope it was the 15th day. Well, we hope it's not necessary at all. And then from the date of that reminder, it's 7 days. It's 1 week. Yep, 1 week. Yeah. But there are ways of making sure we can accept the program within a day or so. You know, we see them in practice, and lots of people say, "Oh, well, I couldn't possibly do that on my project. My project's special." It's unique. It's got these odd things about it. Well, really, seriously, there's a really good section of good practice there, and these people, it's like the best kept secret. Once they've cracked it, it's like they're away, and it solves so many different problems. Because of course the program cuts across so many things. Yeah, well worth looking at those top tips. There's there's webinars and other materials available. Yeah.
Hi. So like acceptance of CEs, right? We are sort of multiple contracts that have got in place, so everything's got a PO on it. But we have lots of outstanding CEs that haven't been approved or accepted.
Okay.
Or then implemented. So where does it stand on that?
Okay, so if by accepted CEs what we mean is if the contractor submitted a compensation event, and then under clause 61.4 you have a week to take a decision, and the decision is it doesn't change the prices or times because it's not a CE or it's your fault or whatever else. Or alternatively, I agree with you, it is a CE, and I instruct quotations. If it's that decision we're talking about, then that also has a sanction. So a contractor could notify you at any time after that 7-day period where you should have replied within that 1 week. So on the 8th day, they could notify you that you have failed to respond. And if your failure persists for a further 2 weeks, it would be treated as a compensation event, and the contractor may progress as though you had instructed them to submit quotations. Now at that stage, presumably a contractor's thinking, well, I've already done my quote. So on the 8th day, I can remind you, on the 14th, 15th day, I can give you my quote. And then we're just into the other sanction we've already discussed, which is quotations submitted, 2 weeks to reply, no reply, remind you. I think if you go on holiday as a project manager for 7 weeks and don't tell anyone, you could find yourself in a lot of problems. So.
So on the NEC4 now, if project manager instructs PICD, contractor is entitled to a payment for generating the quotation. What about if project manager instructs a revised quotation? What about those? It's a minor detail, but still.
If the project manager instructs?
PICD, as far as I remember, an NEC contractor is entitled to a payment for creating a quotation?
Yes, yeah. So PICD, I recognise the term. I can guess that you might use a particular piece of software, but so PICD is proposed instruction change decision in the NEC3 world. When we're trying to write this, particularly in terms of dividing dates and all sorts of other bits and pieces, that just became quite a long sentence. So we asked ourselves, how many people do propose change decisions? And we decided not very many. So in NEC4, it's just proposed instructions now. So the concept is that when instructing quotations for proposed instructions, if you have a client that wants to optioneer a dozen different options and then only choose the last one, each time you do not accept a quotation in relation to a proposed instruction, it triggers a compensation event. Now let's not get too excited about the bureaucratic administration that could cause. It's a small compensation event. It should be a quick one, and we can very quickly put it to bed. But the compensation event price change is the value of, is the assessed defined cost of having to abortively do that quotation that didn't get used. I think it's going to be good. I think that what happens is, I suspect what happens is that contractors feel run around doing this stuff, and in order to, I suspect that we will find a more refined quotation coming back across the table if we're openly paying them to produce what is effectively a design task in some cases. I think it's a really positive thing. We'll get a better quality quote with less risk provision in it, and the contractor gets paid for doing that service. Of course, in an Option E contract, they'd probably suggest opening a design office because they get the defined cost. In C or D, it was eroding any gain share they had. In options A and B, they didn't get anything. It was totally to be covered in the fee. And I think we think that was wrong, and it's changed. Okay.
If you've had projects where NEC4 has been used already, whether finished or not, have you had feedback from client, project manager, or contractor on what they thought of the change from 3 to 4?
Not yet, but we have got some early adopters, and I think that we'll have 2 tranches of feedback from them, I anticipate. I think we'll hear, firstly, obviously in time, what their experiences of it was, but I also think we'll tell a lot by how they've changed it, and I hope that we'll see a minimal amount of Z clauses. I don't want to get on the Z clause, wagon here. I don't think Z clauses are a bad thing, but they do for me fit into a few different categories. There's boilerplate stuff, which I think we covered off a fair bit of that with IP stuff. There's a bit on publicity. There's the corrupt tax and things. So I think we've covered off a few of those boilerplate stuff. There's the unnecessary, completely unnecessary. The contractor shall not do this between these hours. That's not a Z clause. That should be a constraint. And constraints live in the scope, or the works information as it used to be called. So you see a lot of Z clauses that are completely unnecessary, and actually all they do is they harm your ability as the client to change your mind. If you put a constraint in the scope, then you can unilaterally change it with a contemporary mechanism for assessing the impact on defined cost. If you put it in as a Z clause and you want to change it, well then you're into deed of variation and commercial negotiation that you might never achieve. So think carefully about what you're putting in your Z clauses. And the third kind is the potentially dangerous but potentially beautiful Z clause that might improve the NEC4 contract, or at least make it work slightly better for your organisation. And those I would draft delicately. But there's many good ones. Okay. Lots of ECC questions. Nothing about service contracts? Term service contracts? How many people use term service contract? NEC? I suppose I'm at the wrong conference for that. Professional services contract? Yeah. Okay, so for contractors, the professional service subcontract is now available. And the parties to that contract are the contractor and the subcontractor, not consultant and subconsultant. And the reason we did that is because we think the professional services subcontract will predominantly be used by contractors in a design and build environment. So that's a top tip. Okay, looks like we've no more burning NEC questions. Okay, no worries. If you've got anything specific you'd like to ask me, I'll be on my stand across the way there. I think it's stand 19. If you want to come and see me and have a chat, it'd be good to see you. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good rest of the conference.